Okay, so anyway, I was talking about the ship, but yeah, just uh, those guns fired in places across the Pacific while steaming over 100,000 miles. Uh, yeah, so this ship was in action. You can see the places: the Philippines, the South China Sea, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, finally the Japanese home islands, and we'll see a few pictures about all of that. And its history is very intertwined with the Astoria. So bear with me. I'm going to take you down a little bit of a rabbit hole here, but it'll come out and make sense. Okay, so this is the Cramp Shipbuilding Company, their shipyard in Philadelphia, and this is before America even entered the war. September 1941. You can see that the keel of a ship named for Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, has just been laid. There's the keel plate right at the center with everybody around it, and that's a stamp from a commemorative envelope that was released at the time. And you'll also see, if you look an eagle eye, if somebody knows a lot about this, that the Wilkes-Barre on the right side, it says USS CL-90, and we'll come back to that because that's going to change. There was a huge delegation that came from the town to Philly for the event, got a lot of public publicity, made all the papers, including a coal miners choir. And I don't know how well you can see, I don't know how big this is, but they all have a sash that has Wilkes-Barre across it, in coal miner caps. The city was just ecstatic to have a U.S. Navy ship named in their honor. But construction was going to take a while. It was going to take a couple of years. And of course, this is, since I mentioned September 1941, within months following the attack of Pearl Harbor, we were fully at war and a whole lot of things changed. So August 42 rolls around, and with the ship still 6 months from her launch date, tragedy struck in the Pacific. America's very first offensive, Guadalcanal, was 48 hours old, our very first one, a foray into Japanese-held territory. And the Imperial Japanese struck back at sea. 3 American cruisers were sunk in what remains the worst defeat at sea in U.S. Navy history to this day. They were named for the towns of Vincennes, Indiana, Quincy, Massachusetts, and Astoria, Oregon. Actually, all cruisers at the time were named for cities, just a point of trivia. But the Navy decided to rename ships that were being built in honor of those that were lost. And so as a result, in October 1942, the USS Wilkes-Barre that was being built in Philadelphia was renamed for USS Astoria. So that's kind of the first point of connection. And the people of your community had differing opinions on that. There were some pretty salty letters to the editor in the newspaper that I read from the time. People going, why can't they name another ship after these? This is ours. But it all worked out, and the town did get their ship, because in December of 42, there was a new keel laid. They named it the USS Wilkes-Barre CL-103, and it was rushed into production. By then, we were firing on all cylinders as far as shipbuilding was going, and it was launched almost exactly 1 year later on Christmas Eve, 1943. And it was just across the Delaware River in Camden, New Jersey. And the name, it's kind of throws you a little bit. The New York Shipbuilding Company, it actually has nothing to do with New York. So that's always been kind of an interesting angle. But ship launchings come with much ado. So there's the legit Wilkes-Barre being pushed out into the Delaware River, and you can see you saw bunting, you can see the flags on everything. There were commemorative envelopes and stamps, Christmas cards. There was just a ton that was done in celebration of that ship finally being put into the water. But there was more than 6 months left before she could actually be put into commission. She still had to be finished, and the biggest challenge was she needed a crew. And that's where we go to Naval Training Station Sampson on Lake Seneca in upstate New York. This was one of 6 big facilities that were processing men, using just a manufacturing facility for sailors. And we needed a tremendous number of them in the Navy. So I want to read you a second quick passage from the book, and I promise this is the last one. But it just kind of explains what these guys were looking at. They came from all walks of life, the men and boys who stepped off the train in January 1944. A multitude of draftees shuffled into ranks alongside fresh-faced boys newly eligible and eager to enlist. The assembled recruits filled the growing needs of a Navy that entered the war with a scant 300,000 men across the globe. The number of Navy Blue Jackets now in service passed 2 million at year's end, with another million more slated for induction throughout 1944. They reflected the scale of worldwide warfare. 17-year-old kids who lied about their age assembled shoulder to shoulder with men of 30-odd years forced to leave behind wives, children, and the best paying work they had seen in more than a decade. Not all came willingly. The culture shock permeated from the start. One of the sailors that I interviewed here, he wrote, "None of us had been away from home too much, and suddenly we were thrown into a group with absolutely no choice in the matter. We met and lived with characters that we never would have selected in civilian life, and all of that was part of our indoctrination. Each trainload brought high school letterman jackets alongside business suit coats. In any case, attire didn't matter. It would be promptly mailed back to family members and replaced with Navy issue clothing from head to toe. The hairstyles and facial hair reflected personal identity. That was likewise shorn away. You'll be sorry," came the taunt from other men who had themselves just gone through the process. So at the time that the Wilkes-Barre was put into commission, 4 out of 5 men on the ship had never been to sea. Many of them had never even seen the ocean. And the chart at the left is just a little graphic to show that's what the size of the Navy looked like before the war. And by the time we are here in 1944, it's expanded to 10 times its size. So this gentleman really had his work cut out for him. That's Captain Robert Porter, Annapolis class of 1917. And this was only his second sea command, and it was his first of the war. You can see the little snipping of the ship's newspaper at right. One of the things he got right off the bat was getting the crew involved in feeling like this was their home, and they promptly named the Wilkes-Barre the Willie B. And so the Willie B became a beloved name, and just will turn into an outstanding ship. So the first thing you do with a new ship is you go on a shakedown cruise. And the standard practice for East Coast ships was to go down to Trinidad and Tobago, that area. And the whole way you're training, you're shooting guns, you're doing all the, you're learning your job basically. The two stated purposes by the Navy are to identify construction problems, to see if there's anything that needs to be fixed on the ship, to train the men. But the third unstated thing that is done is getting men's sea legs under them for someone who's never been at sea for any lengthy period of time. The standard joke with some of these guys was they were the best fed people in the Navy. They got 6 meals a day, 3 going up, 3 coming, or 3 going down, 3 coming back up. Their principal role was going to be protecting the weapon of naval warfare, which had recently emerged as the most vital in projecting force from the sea, and that's aircraft carriers. That was something Japan proved to us very devastating fashion at Pearl Harbor. But by 1944, this meant American ships that were newly built, capable of steaming above 30 knots, capable of launching almost 100 fighter and bomber planes. This one right here is USS Bunker Hill, and that is a ship we will most certainly return to. But by late 1944, America had built plenty of them. So if you're a sailor on the Wilkes-Barre, your ultimate destination is reporting to join the Pacific Fleet. You're joining the Fast Carrier Task Force, which is seen here at Anchorage in an atoll called Ulithi during support of the Philippines operation. And that's a cruiser just like Wilkes-Barre in the foreground, and that's in front of at least a dozen aircraft carriers. And that wasn't all of them. By this point in the war, 16 full-size fleet carriers would go out at once, and they needed ships to protect them, and the Wilkes-Barre is one of them. So you start doing your job, operating with the fleet. You learn how to fuel at sea from a ship that's called an oiler or a tanker. They provide the fuel you need, and shouting across at each other, you usually learn they also have the latest scuttlebutt, which is the Navy term for gossip and news. Some of it true, some of it rumor. You also resupplied at sea. You're bringing aboard ammunition food, supplies of all kinds, and the single most important thing to a sailor or Marine aboard ship, and that would be mail from home. You're going to spend plenty of time carrying heavy stuff, schlepping material, rotating through the scullery to clean dishes, standing watch at your station in shifts. If you're a gunner's mate, you're going to practice loading shells. These are for the big guns, the 6-inch main battery and the 5-inch secondary, practiced on these machines. While their smaller caliber counterparts man the anti-aircraft tubs. And mind you, again, these were all taken aboard the Wilkes-Barre. Your ship has an aviation division. Believe it or not, cruisers flew airplanes from the back of the ship. They launch them off of that short catapult that you see at the middle of the frame, and then land the plane on the water and pick it up by a crane, hoist it back aboard, and do it again. They did a good job of rescuing downed aviators late in the war. They figured out that these planes that were originally used just for aerial spotting and observation could actually make rescues, and they saved quite a few lives. Official name of that plane would be the Kingfisher, but aboard ship, you would have called it a Goonie bird. But the ship's a floating city, 1,300 men aboard. So you have trades across representing everything, welding, everything from that to a shoe cobbler or a tailor. You had a dentist, you had a doctor, you had medical staff, and you called them pill rollers. So you're finally in the fray. After almost exactly 2 years to the day from the keel being laid on the ship, almost exactly 1 year past commissioning, the Willie B took part in her first combat mission with her task force. By the way, I haven't mentioned the camouflage on the ships, and if anybody has a question about that, just a quick side note, it's not designed to conceal the ship. It's just designed to confuse the enemy as to its course and heading from a distance. So if you're in a submarine and you're a couple of miles away looking through big binoculars or something, through a periscope, then you'll be able to tell there's a ship there, but you won't be able to tell how big it is and what direction it's headed, and you won't be able to intercept it. But planes from the aircraft carriers in this mission struck targets across the northern Philippines, and Willie B stood watch over carriers just like she's doing, as you can see with the aircraft carrier in the foreground. This task force steamed through the South China Sea and from the Philippines, and actually went as far as modern day Vietnam, which was called French Indochina at the time, in search of enemy ships. They really wanted to find the Japanese fleet, which they did not do. What they found instead was weather, and plenty of it. So what you're seeing here is weather from a typhoon in that area. That's a twin sister ship of the Willie B. And keep in mind, it looks like it's being tossed around by a toy, and it is. That's a 40+ degree roll, which is dangerously close to capsizing. But that ship is 2 football fields long. That's how big those ships were that were being tossed around in heavy seas. And this one was actually taken from the Wilkes-Barre, and it shows the bow crashing under the surface as shipping water up. They actually had to turn the forward guns and elevate them to keep water from going down through the gun barrels down into the ship. Now it's February 1945, and we're headed to Tokyo. This is the first strikes against Japanese at Tokyo since the Doolittle raid, which had happened in April of 1942, so 3 years earlier. And at that time, that was mostly just for a morale effort. So that was 16 planes sending bombs. Now we're sending 16 full aircraft carriers and literally 1,000 planes. So what a difference 3 years of manufacturing and war experience has done. So again, there's another view of Willie B on her way to Japan. And there's them launching their planes. That's again the Bunker Hill. That's the ship that she was primarily assigned to. And they made a side detour to a little place called Iwo Jima. At the time it was 3 cruisers, the Wilkes-Barre, Astoria, and Pasadena, all broke away from the carriers for a couple of days to really help out. Things weren't going so well at Iwo Jima, and they needed more guns. They needed ships that could fire, and they sent they sent these cruisers over. And so of course, you know, this photo, this is probably the most famous photograph of World War II. And at the time this was being taken, well, the Willie B was there too. And she had her planes spotting their fire over the north end of the island for the ship. And they pounded away for 24 hours in support of advancing Marines and really helped the cause in getting them moving, getting things going again. These ships actually only came off the line for one reason, and that's simply because they ran out of shells. That's them firing their guns. And if you look close, you can see a number of ships on the horizon in the background. There's Mount Suribachi, which is being hit by shells. And then at right, that's the spent casings from their shells. They kept all of those because they recycled the brass. So you try to have some fun here and there wherever you can find a few minutes. They did have a recreation area back at their anchorage at Ulithi called Mog Mog, and it was a pretty rough place. You had to spend time surrounded by thousands of other folks, find a little bit of real estate that was your own. You'd get ration chits for 3 cans of hot beer. You might spend a little time on a coral beach, maybe play a little pickup game of baseball. Just anything to feel normal again. I also tried to do a little bit of recreation aboard ship. Boxing matches were very popular on the fantail. Not only was that a popular activity, but it was also a good way for 2 guys to settle a beef if they had one. But by March, you're headed back out. The final stepping stone to Japan, and you're preparing it for assault, the island group of Okinawa. So Willie B and her task group were headed to, first of all, send planes over southern Japan and then work their way back down to support the invasion forces in Okinawa. And this is where they really got into the thick of it with kamikazes. So I want to just address the kamikaze really quickly. There's a common misconception with people that the Japanese pilots, that they did this throughout the course of the war. That's simply not true. This was something that didn't really come into being in any organized form until just a few months earlier. It was really in those final few months of the war where young men and boys were being put into planes and being asked or told to give their lives in the interest of trading one plane for a ship. And Americans were horrified at the tactic, but at the same time wanted to keep it under wraps. So the American public at this point in time still didn't even know it existed. It was not being reported in newspapers. It wasn't being reported even to the press. But it was something that would come very, very much into play here. Throughout this whole period, men kept secret diaries. And they had some really creative methods for doing it. This gentleman right here, this is actually an Astoria sailor, but he kept his diary on this map, and he would write entries as they moved around. Other folks, one wrote his in Greg's shorthand, so that if an officer found it, he couldn't read it and would have no idea what he's doing, because these were completely against regulations for them to keep diaries like this. I think that's probably the main reason that they did it, just because they weren't supposed to. But there's a valuable historical record as a result. And that's actually where the title of my book came from, is this gentleman right here on one day wrote, "It had rained steel for 3 days." And that's what he's referring to. Steel shrapnel from exploding anti-aircraft fire, raining down on the ship decks, planking off men's helmets. This again was taken from Wilkes-Barre on that same day. And that's the Bunker Hill. She's protecting and shooting down a plane to bring it down short of the Bunker Hill. But carriers did get hit. The first one in this outing was USS Franklin, which was bombed heavily and knocked out of the war. Here's another picture taken from Astoria. That's USS Cabot, about to be hit. Split second before. You can see the plane on its way in. For the 4 carrier task groups that were operating near one another at this time, in the days that followed and the weeks that followed, by far, the Willie B's group got hit the hardest. And by now, it was the 4 ships working together, these four cruisers working in an anti-aircraft capacity. So you've got them, they call themselves the WASP division by this point, because they're named after it's named after the first letter of each ship, the Wilkes-Barre, the Astoria, the Springfield, and the Pasadena. And they got really good at bringing down Japanese planes and protecting their ships. But sometimes things got through. This was the very next day after the Cabot. USS Hancock also hit by a kamikaze right by the Willie B. Days later, Willie B herself was almost hit, bringing down this plane just short. And you can see she's in an evasive turn, and all the splashes around or is the steel rain. That's shrapnel coming down as the plane crashes at the left side of the frame, and fortunately just missed the ship. Within a couple of days, all four of the WASP division ships endured similar near misses, just like this one. 3 of them were within a couple of minutes of one another. This went on for almost 3 months. Just relentless attacks, constant time at duty stations. And this is the reality of what it looked like when you bring a plane down. Men ate at their stations, they slept at their stations. And by this point in time, by April, the American public was starting to find out about the kamikaze. Some news, they got to the point where they just couldn't keep it from the public anymore, because there were so many damaged ships that were being sent back for repair. It was just impossible to keep the secret. But 79 days, 79 consecutive days on the line for these gentlemen. No operation of such duration had ever been conducted. And the Navy would later conclude that it simply went beyond the limits of human endurance. There were just too many emerging cases of what they at the time called situational psychosis, because we didn't have any concept of PTSD or its treatment at the time. And then came the biggest day for the Willie B. USS Bunker Hill was her primary charge, and 2 Japanese planes snuck in at the back of American planes that were landing. There was a lot of Corsair pilots that were landing back on Bunker Hill, and these planes snuck in behind. Nobody saw them or picked them up, and 2 of them hit the Bunker Hill within 60 seconds of each other. So the Willie B sprung into action. There was a 3rd attacking plane, and the men of the ship were very proud of this, and it doesn't get a lot of mention in books, but there was a 3rd plane, and they brought it down short and likely saved the ship certainly from further damage. So that's Bunker Hill on fire, and that's the Wilkes-Barre in the foreground. Here's a color picture taken at the same time. And across the task group, you have to understand these task groups were miles across, and on all these other ships, men were just helpless to do anything. All they could do is sit there and watch. This was the scene on Bunker Hill. You can imagine those used to be airplanes. That's the strength of the fires they were fighting. And that was in Life magazine. But Willie B was closest, and she sprung into action. That's her crew up on deck. And it may be hard to see at the center of the picture, but that's a bunch of hoses from the ship. They've been well trained in firefighting and damage control. And so they are actively fighting fires. They've actually been right up against the side of the carrier Bunker Hill and helped push it, tilt it in a turn to take flaming aviation fuel, gasoline, and burning materials, and push it over the side of the carrier. And it helped extinguish the fires before they came in and started fighting them. There's a close-up. This is one of Bob Brent E's photos. Again, these are ones that have never been published. And that's the scene on Bunker Hill. That's what it's like when you have lower decks burning and men scrambling, trying to do anything to get away from the fires in the conflagration. And the water pouring down is from the hoses from the Willie B, trying to keep them safe. And they did as much as they could. They brought over men who were wounded, and they worked on them on deck. Those are Navy corpsmen, and they are doing everything they can to help men who have smoke inhalation, who have injuries. And they saved a lot of lives. Ultimately, the fires were extinguished, but by then the Bunker Hill had been completely gutted. 393 sailors and Marines had been killed or went overboard and were missing. 264 more lay wounded, many of them aboard the Willie B. She transferred critical cases, badly wounded, to a hospital ship over the course of the next 2 days. And her Marines and her chaplain and her crew very respectfully buried at sea those that had died aboard their ship. Gave a salute in the process. But you go back out. War's not over yet. Ships now in new paint schemes. They changed colors on them. That's the Willie B in a new paint camouflage pattern. They painted them dark gray and blue. So because by this point, the threat came from the air. They weren't worried about submarines and surface ships anywhere near as much as they were kamikaze aircraft. Okay, I do want to lighten things up for a moment. I just had to sneak this one in. So this is a fun shot. That's at left. That is the Wilkes-Barre in the background, and this was taken from Astoria because the Astoria was getting ready to go home. She had gotten there first, and she was coming out of the rotation. So they used these drones. They had these target drones that they would fly remote control airplanes and fire at them, and they wanted to keep the drones in the theater, and so they're moving them over to the Willie B from the Astoria just to keep them there. And at right, that is someone who was working in the radio plane aircraft factory in Los Angeles building those drones, and her name is Norma Jean Mortensen. That is the picture where she was quote unquote discovered, and most of us know her as Marilyn Monroe. So now you can get from the Willie B to Marilyn Monroe in one move. There's your piece of trivia. Oh, let me go back for a second. One other thing happened. That photo was taken on August 7th, and I don't mean to pound you with dates, but the reason August 7th, 1945 is an important date is that the same day they were making this move and transferring everything, they also learned that a brand new kind of bomb had been dropped the day before over the city of Hiroshima. And of course, a second would follow 2 days later. So within days, we get the surrender announcement, and you get two types of photos. You get one on the left that's the public relations shot. That's what makes the newspapers. And then you get the one on the right, which is a photographer being candid. And that's two ships just side by side. Men were standing to listen to the announcement, and they go right back to work because they know they're not going anywhere. War may be over, but they are sitting right where they are. So the Willie B became part of the group that steams for Tokyo Bay. They're part of the ships that are picked to be part of that, the surrender ceremony. But you're not going alone, taking a whole lot of naval might with you to really send an impression and a message. This is from Bob Brent E, and you don't have to read all the text or anything, but it's just point being, by this point, even he was keeping a journal, and they released the restrictions on it. So he had a fascinating account of what it was like as they went into Tokyo Bay, into the harbor, and they were still concerned that what if the war wasn't really over yet? We haven't signed anything. But that's Wilkes-Barre at right. That's an American battleship behind her. And that is in Tokyo Bay, and you can see Mount Fuji in the background. And they were there for this signing of the end of World War II. Of course, that's MacArthur, Halsey, Nimitz sitting at the table signing. And you might get a little card as proof that you were present for that surrender signing. You keep that in your wallet for future years, as many of the guys on the ship did. Your Marines got ready to go ashore for occupation duties. It wasn't over yet. You had to police the area, get things stabilized. There was a ton of work still to be done. Of course, this was shot on the Willie B's fantail, and you can see the planes in the background on the ship. You might get to send some letters home. The restrictions have been lifted. You can now tell people where you are. And so the stamps come back that say USS Wilkes-Barre, Tokyo Bay, the airmail. Airmail was 6 cents, by the way. Okay, you might have a victory dinner. What is this? 21 September 1945. They finally got to eat a decent meal. And you may not be able to read this. So at the bottom it says, Pat, the best dinner we've had since the 1st of July. It tasted plenty good after almost 3 months of dry and canned goods. This is the official menu posted in the messing compartment at our new meal, September 22nd. So nothing like finally getting off of K rations. And the ship's looking pretty beat up by this point. It's badly in need of a refit, but you still sit. You know fully well that men are coming home from Europe and now even starting their way back from the Pacific. And there you are, while they're getting jobs and getting the girls. And the mail from home starts becoming a deluge of Dear John letters. Many men spoke about that. But throughout November, December, Willie B stayed there, steamed to ports in Korea, Incheon actually, and in China. They were one of the ships that was assigned to oversee demilitarization of Japanese forces in occupied areas. They spent another Thanksgiving and Christmas aboard ship, finally getting orders to head for home in mid-January 1946. But they did get the orders. And this is them on their way home. This may be hard for you to know what you're looking at, but it's shot looking at the stern of the ship, looking back from the superstructure from way up high. And that is heading home pennant. It's a very long streamer that's being held up by weather balloons. And they drape that behind the ship in celebration of the fact that they're finally going home. And it's still visible in this photo. This is taken once they arrived back in California on January 31st, fully 5 months after the surrender and victory over Japan had been signed. So men start leaving the ship, men who were neophytes who had been raw boots out of Samson. Now they're salty veterans. They're saying goodbye to their friends while there's new sailors coming aboard. And the Willie B gets transferred to the Atlantic. This is March 14th, 1946. So she went through the Panama Canal for the second time. She actually went through it going over, and then this is the second and last time she would ever go through the Panama Canal. When she was transferred to the Atlantic Fleet, she made cruises to Cuba, Guantanamo Bay, and later made a visit to several ports in the UK. This is her at Guantanamo. Ultimately, we had too many ships, and the Navy started downsizing very quickly. Once the war was over, that huge production effort, there were just a lot of ships that we didn't need anymore, and the Wilkes-Barre was one of them. So she only was in service for 3 years. She was taken out on this date. You can see this is an envelope for her last day of postal service, and she was mothballed. And what that meant was we're going to keep the ship just in case we need it in the future. So through the 1950s, through the 1960s, she sat in a mothballed condition, and they just put these domes over the gun emplacements to protect them and do all these things to protect the ship from deteriorating. But by 1971, here's another piece of trivia. She was the last light cruiser in the American inventory. But her fate came a year later. In 1972, they decided, okay, we don't need any more light cruisers. So they towed her out off the Florida Keys and said, we're going to use the Willie B in underwater weapons testing. And in one test, she unexpectedly broke in half after the explosives went off and sank. So to this day, USS Wilkes-Barre CL-103, the Willie B, serves both as an artificial reef and a popular deep diving site. Her sailors are almost all gone now, but they kept the souvenirs. Maybe they kept a matchbook in their wallet or an envelope, newspaper clippings, maybe some old photographs. They maybe even made a painting of their beloved ship. but she served in her country well when she was called, and she saved a lot of lives when the moment came. So I hope this presentation has given you a better understanding of what that bell and those anchors represent. Maybe you can visit them sometime and just consider the sacrifices made by so many. Thank you all very much for your time. Thank you for listening.
Brent, that was fantastic. Thank you very much for that. We are going to have a little time for some Q&A. We've gone over a few different ways to do this. Probably the easiest through Zoom and through the microphone is if you have a question, why don't you come up to the podium and you can actually see Brent and you can ask him your question, and then when he answers it, it'll come through the PA and everybody will be able to hear the answer. Don't be shy. Oh, come on. I know somebody has a question. All right, Sherry, you could start us off.
I was either boring or thorough.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. It was excellent. My father was World War II. He was Army, and my uncle, his brother, was Navy. I'm curious, what drew you to the interest of these ships?
It honestly started with my grandfather's service and his brother. The fact that he never spoke about it, and he passed away when I was younger, and I never had an opportunity to ask him about it. And it started as a genealogy project and a hobby. So I built a website surrounding the Astoria ship, and within a matter of weeks, I had people reaching out, sending messages, asking for information, and they all said the same thing. My dad never talked about it. My grandfather was quiet. We never got a chance to ask him. It was just over and over again. You just had that refrain. And I just realized the further we got into this. Oh, and then I heard the photographer for the ship reached out within a few weeks. He said, "Hey, you got a bunch of my pictures up there." And that started a 10-year friendship on our part. And we grew it into something. And so it just kind of evolved.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you for listening.
Anyone else? Any other questions? Come on up. Don't be shy.
What's his name? Brent? Hi, Brent.
Hi there.
My name is Sherry Aponic, and it so happens my brother-in-law, who was the commander, brought this to Wilkes-Barre in the Navy when it was set up around the courthouse.
No kidding. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. That's wonderful. I'm so glad your community has that. There's a lot of these ships, there's just nothing left. And the fact that you all had the presence of mind to save those anchors in that ship's bell, it's
amazing.
Very meaningful. Very meaningful.
I thought you'd like to know that.
I love to know that. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Mark, you can't hear what's being said up
there. Oh, okay. Well, Ms. Aponic was saying her father-in-law was basically the mover and the shaker. He's the one who helped get us the anchors and the bell at the courthouse. He helped arrange all that. Now I think I broke the microphone. That aside, Molly?
I'm sorry, I don't have a question, but I know it was a great presentation, by the way. Thank you.
This is our board president, Brent.
Oh, hello.
Hi there.
I'm going to tell people to come up and get.
Yes, I was going to tell them that if we were done. I did not forget that. You're asking if the fat guy forgot dessert. Really? Come on. But if there are no other questions, I want to thank you again, Brent. I will definitely be in touch this week because we definitely have to trade some photos back and forth, some scans. And I want to thank you for doing this, not just for the Historical Society, not just for the annual dinner, but for the community at large. This was fantastic. So just
thank you all so very much for your time. And I'm going to go have some Planters peanuts, by the way.
Yes. Yes.
All right. Take care, everybody. Thank you again.
Thanks, buddy.